By 1945, for millions of German soldiers, surrender was not a rescue. It was a roll of the dice. 11 million found themselves captives across collapsing fronts where survival odds shifted with geography and the temper of their captors. In the East, captivity often meant starvation, deadly marches, and almost certain attrition. In the West, systems promised safety but sometimes buckled under chaos. Does laying down a weapon end the danger, or does it simply begin a new kind of struggle? The answer is far darker and far more dependent on fate than most realize. German surrender in the war's final year did not unfold as a trickle, but as a flood. In June 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy triggered a cascade of collapses. By August, the Falaise pocket alone yielded nearly 50,000 German prisoners in a matter of days. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives like Operation Bagration swept up hundreds of thousands more, with daily intakes sometimes reaching 20 or 30,000 men. Across both fronts, command posts, scattered units, and entire regiments laid down arms by the thousands, often in confusion and haste. By the start of 1945, the numbers became unmanageable. The United States recorded a monthly average of 45 to 60,000 new prisoners through the winter and spring, peaking in April as the Ruhr pocket broke and Model's Army Group B surrendered en masse. Soviet records, though less precise, point to a similar avalanche. In the final weeks around Berlin, Soviet forces processed as many as 800,000 German captives, overwhelming every available holding area. The machinery for handling prisoners strained and buckled. Temporary enclosures sprang up in open fields and along riverbanks. Barbed wire marked the boundaries, but little else separated the living from the elements. Food, shelter, and medical supplies lagged far behind the pace of surrender. For many, the moment of capture was not the end of danger. It was the beginning of a new ordeal, shaped less by individual action than by the scale of collapse and the capacity or incapacity of the victors to absorb the flood. A German soldier's fate after surrender hinged less on his will to survive than on the invisible lines that carved up Europe. The moment of capture, whether in a French hedgerow or the ruins east of the Oder, set off two diverging stories. In the West, American and British authorities operated under the Geneva Convention's framework. Camps were crowded and supplies stretched thin, but official policy demanded rations, shelter, and medical care, even as the system buckled under numbers never imagined by peacetime planners. Food shipments sometimes lagged, shelter was improvised, and disease spread in the chaos. But the machinery of compliance, Red Cross visits, prisoner registration, and written standards remained in place, however strained. To the east, the rules changed. The Soviet Union had never ratified the Geneva Convention, and the devastation left by the German invasion colored every decision. Surrendered soldiers became both a resource and a liability. Soviet authorities viewed German prisoners of war as a labor force to rebuild shattered cities and factories, and as a form of reparation for the millions dead on Soviet soil. Camps stretched from the Volga to the Urals and beyond, supplied by rail lines that were themselves barely functional. Rations fell far below subsistence, medical care was minimal, and the system's first priority was containment, not survival. For many, the journey east meant weeks in open rail cars, exposure to the elements, and a wait for allocation to labor camps that might lie thousands of kilometers from the front. Geography, more than rank or record, became the silent arbiter. A soldier surrendering to the Americans or British could expect a measure of order, however imperfect. Those captured by Soviet forces faced a system shaped by revenge, scarcity, and the sheer scale of destruction. The line between survival and attrition was often drawn not by individual actions but by the longitude of surrender. Surrender on the Eastern Front often began with silence, then the sudden bark of orders as German soldiers filed out from ruined cellars or snowy ditches. In February 1943, after the collapse at Stalingrad, nearly 90,000 men stumbled from their last positions into Soviet hands. The guns had ceased, but the fight for life was only beginning. The temperature hovered well below zero. Many wore only thin tunics or threadbare greatcoats, boots wrapped in rags. Soviet guards herded prisoners into makeshift pens, barbed wire strung across open fields. No tents, no fires, just bare ground and drifting snow. Night brought a deadly stillness. With no shelter, men huddled together, frost collecting on uniforms and faces. Some tried to dig shallow pits for warmth, but the frozen earth refused. Others collapsed where they stood, never rising again. Field reports from that winter describe hundreds dying each night from exposure alone. Typhus and dysentery moved quickly through the ranks, fueled by overcrowding and contaminated water. Food, when it arrived, meant a crust of bread or a ladle of thin soup, never enough to restore strength lost on the march. Guards, themselves exhausted and weary, kept order with rifle butts and shouted commands. In these first days, survival was a matter of endurance and luck. The ordeal of captivity was already claiming lives before the first transport east had even begun. Rail convoys pulled away from the Volga in early 1943, carrying thousands of German prisoners into the depths of the Soviet interior. The journey from Stalingrad to camps like Omsk stretched more than 2,500 kilometers. Prisoners rode in unheated cattle cars, packed 50 or more to a wagon, with little food and almost no medical care. The cold seeped in through the wooden slats, and men huddled together for warmth, but frostbite and exhaustion claimed many before the first stop. Soviet records from March 1943 show nearly 20,000 Axis prisoners of war registered, but by the time trains reached the Urals, thousands had vanished from the rolls, dead from disease, exposure, or left behind along the tracks. Arrival at the transit camps offered little relief. The sick and weakened were separated from those deemed fit for labor. Survivors faced a new lottery: assignment to logging camps in the Ural forests, mining in Siberia, or construction projects deep inside Kazakhstan. The odds of ever returning home plummeted with each transfer. Of the original 90,000 men taken at Stalingrad, fewer than 5,000 survived to see Germany again. For most, the journey east was not a passage to safety, but the start of a slow, grinding attrition, death by distance, by hunger, and by the machinery of forced labor that stretched across a continent. Across the Soviet Union, the fate of a German prisoner was measured in distance. The GUPVY, the Soviet Agency for Prisoner of War Administration, mapped out a vast archipelago of camps stretching from the Volga to the Arctic Circle and deep into Siberia. Once the first weeks of captivity ended, survivors of the initial marches and makeshift pens faced a new ordeal: forced relocation by rail and foot, often covering thousands of kilometers. Orders from Moscow set quotas for each region: timber from the Urals, coal from Kuzba, bricks from the ruins of Stalingrad, turning prisoners into a mobile labor pool to be allocated as needed. The process began with sorting at transit camps. Those deemed fit were assigned to sectors like forestry, mining, or construction, each with its own mortality profile. GUPVE officials tracked the flow with ledgers and directives: 20% to the Ural forests, 15% to Siberian mines, 25% to road and railway projects. Prisoners found themselves loaded into unheated boxcars, sometimes 50 or more to a wagon, for journeys that could last weeks. The route from Stalingrad to Omsk alone spanned over 2,500 kilometers. Other convoys ran from the ruins of Berlin north to Vorkuta, a journey of more than 3,000 kilometers, ending at labor sites above the Arctic Circle. The transfers were not just a matter of logistics, they were a test of survival. Overcrowding, exhaustion, and disease thinned the ranks even before the first work detail began. Soviet records from the spring of 1943 show that of the nearly 20,000 Axis prisoners of war registered after Stalingrad, thousands disappeared from the rolls during transit. The journey itself became a filter, separating those who would reach the labor camps from those left behind along the tracks. For the survivors, arrival at a new camp did not mean safety, only a different form of struggle, one dictated by quotas, geography, and the relentless demands of reconstruction. The forced movement of prisoners across regions and categories of labor turned the Soviet prisoner of war system into a machine powered as much by distance as by discipline. Inside the Soviet camp system, daily life for German prisoners revolved around a mathematics of survival. Official ration tables set the allowance for most prisoners between 500 and 650 calories, barely a quarter of what a healthy adult required. For those assigned to the most demanding labor, rations sometimes rose to 800 calories, but even this could not sustain men weakened by months of fighting, forced marches, and exposure. Bread was weighed in grams, soup thinned to the point of transparency, and meat, when it appeared, was measured in scraps. Starvation was not an accident, but a function of scarcity and policy. As Soviet authorities struggled to feed their own population and rebuild cities, prisoners of war fell to the bottom of the supply chain. Disease flourished in these conditions. Typhus swept through crowded barracks and open pens, carried by lice that thrived in unwashed clothing and unheated shelters. Dysentery and tuberculosis followed, fueled by contaminated water and exhaustion. Medical care was minimal, 1 or 2 doctors for thousands, with little more than bandages and aspirin. In the worst outbreaks, entire sections of camps were quarantined behind extra wire, the sick left to die in isolation. Soviet records from the early years list hundreds of thousands of cases. Estimates for deaths from typhus alone exceed 200,000 among Axis prisoners. The numbers are imprecise, but the pattern is clear. More died from hunger and disease than from bullets or brutality. For those who survived the first winters, time itself became a new adversary. The war ended, but captivity did not. Soviet authorities held back releases, using German prisoners as a labor force for reconstruction and as bargaining chips in the emerging Cold War. Negotiations between West Germany and the Soviet Union dragged on for years. Only in 1955, a full decade after the fighting stopped, did the final mass release of German prisoners of war from Soviet camps take place. By then, the survivors had spent years building roads, mining coal, and clearing rubble, each day shaped by the same arithmetic of calories and contagion that had defined their captivity from the start. Registration began almost as soon as prisoners crossed into Western Allied hands. American and British units followed a set of procedures laid out in the 1929 Geneva Convention and reinforced by their own military manuals. Each new arrival was logged, assigned a number, and given a basic medical inspection. The process was mechanical but crucial, because without it, the system would have collapsed under the sheer volume of men pouring in from the front. Camps ranged from former military barracks to fenced-off fields, hastily converted to hold thousands. Even at their most crowded, these camps operated under a framework that demanded a minimum standard of care. Rations, when available, averaged between 2,400 and 2,500 calories per day. Bread, potatoes, canned meat, and ersatz coffee made up the bulk of the diet. Medical triage separated the wounded and sick from the able-bodied, with field hospitals set up nearby. Red Cross parcels and visits, though delayed by logistics, offered some oversight and occasional relief. Work details were organized for camp maintenance or nearby farms, but forced labor in hazardous conditions was officially prohibited. Communication with families, though slow, was permitted through Red Cross channels. The routines, roll calls, meal lines, medical checks imposed order on chaos. For most, survival odds improved dramatically compared to the East. The system bent under strain, but the baseline standards of the Geneva Convention remained visible, if sometimes only just. In the West, captivity was harsh and uncertain, but rarely fatal by design. By the spring of 1945, the Western Allies faced a logistical test without precedent. Along the Rhine, a network of open-air enclosures known as the Rhine Meadow Camps took in wave after wave of German prisoners. Within weeks, the population swelled to between 150,000 and 200,000 men, far beyond what any peacetime plan had imagined. Barbed wire marked the boundaries, but inside, shelter was almost non-existent. Most prisoners dug shallow pits for cover or slept exposed to rain and wind. Sanitation lagged behind, and food supplies struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume of arrivals. The system buckled under this strain. Official policy still called for adherence to the Geneva Convention, but rations fell below intended standards, and medical care was basic at best. Red Cross access, once routine, became sporadic as authorities scrambled to maintain order. The death toll within these camps remains the subject of fierce debate. Burial registers and camp reports, analyzed by historian Rudiger Overmans, point to a mortality figure in the low thousands, perhaps around 1,000 deaths, suggesting that, while conditions were harsh, mass fatalities were not the rule. James Back, drawing on survivor testimony and extrapolations from incomplete records, argued for a much higher toll, claiming tens of thousands or even more perished in these enclosures. Most recent scholarship, however, finds little support for such high estimates, citing the lack of physical evidence and the structure of Allied reporting. What is clear is that the Rhine Meadow camps expose the limits of even well-intentioned systems when confronted by numbers that overwhelmed every logistical calculation. For the men trapped behind the wire, survival depended less on malice than on the machinery's ability or inability to keep them alive. In the months after Germany's surrender, the fate of many prisoners in Western hands took an unexpected turn. While American and British authorities moved quickly to begin repatriation, France faced a country shattered by occupation and war. German POWs became a workforce for reconstruction, pressed into tasks that ranged from rebuilding roads to clearing mines left behind in fields and towns. The French Ministry of Reconstruction organized these men into labor battalions, known as BTPG units, each numbering between 1,500 to 2,000. For some, the assignment meant repairing bridges or working farms. For others, it meant walking into danger every day, searching for hidden explosives with little more than sticks and hope. Official casualty reports from French authorities estimate that several thousand German POWs died during this period, with mine-clearing accidents accounting for a significant share. The explosion near Trier in 1946, which killed dozens in a single moment, stands as a grim example of the risks these men faced long after the guns had fallen silent. Demographic studies suggest that, across all French custody, total deaths ranged from 3,000 to 5,000, much higher than in British or American camps, but still a fraction of the losses recorded further east. The numbers tell the story of a continent divided not just by politics, but by survival odds. In the West, even the most hazardous labor rarely pushed mortality above 1%. In the Soviet Union, estimates vary, but the death rate among German POWs reached 30% or more. Geography, above all, determined whether the struggle after surrender would end in return or in a grave far from home. For millions, captivity did not end with silence. It became a generational shadow shaping post-war Germany's memory and identity. Today, estimates vary, but tens of thousands remain unaccounted for, their fates unresolved. The aftermath lingers in families and archives alike, a reminder that legal frameworks fracture under strain. When war collapses order, survival often hangs on chance, not convention. What do you make of this legacy? Share your thoughts below.